She was the only bridge between an American corporation and the Arab business world. One wrong word could vaporize billions. Then, in the middle of negotiations, they removed her. They didn't know that her dismissal had just triggered a buried clause in the contract, something that would bring their empire crashing down within 24 hours. They thought I was replaceable. They thought language was just words. They were about to learn that in the Middle East, trust isn't built in boardrooms, it's built over years, one carefully chosen phrase at a time. My name is Samantha Whitford, though everyone at Halberg and West called me Sam. For 12 years, I'd been the invisible thread holding together deals worth billions. The voice that transformed corporate American arrogance into respectful Arabic discourse. But on that Tuesday morning in March, sitting in our 42nd floor conference room overlooking Manhattan, I was about to become expendable. The mahogany table reflected the faces of 8 men from Al-Mutayri Holdings, their traditional white thobes a stark contrast to our Wall Street suits. Chairman Abdullah Al-Mutayri sat directly across from me, his weathered hands folded with the patience of someone who'd built an empire from sand and oil. To his right, his son Khalid reviewed documents I translated 3 times to ensure every nuance aligned with both Sharia law and New York state regulations. I was mid-sentence, explaining a crucial liability clause in Gulf Arabic dialect, when Julian Cross walked in, young, Harvard-minted, and radiating the kind of confidence that comes from never having failed catastrophically. He'd been our new project director for exactly 6 weeks, long enough to reorganize our department chart, but not long enough to understand why some names on that chart were written in permanent ink. Samantha, he said, his voice cutting through my explanation like a mistuned violin in a symphony. The Arabs noticed. I saw it in the subtle shift of their shoulders, the way Khalid's pen stopped moving. In their culture, interrupting someone mid-translation wasn't just rude, it was a declaration that the words being spoken held no value. We need to make a personnel adjustment, Julian continued, oblivious to the temperature change in the room. Behind him, Layla Morton entered, 26, fresh from her MBA, clutching an iPad like a life preserver. I'd trained her for 3 months. She knew enough Arabic to order coffee and compliment someone's tie. Layla will be taking over as liaison for the remainder of this deal, Julian announced. Samantha, HR is waiting for you in conference room B. The silence that followed had weight. It pressed against the windows, settled into the leather chairs, made the air conditioning seem suddenly too loud. Chairman Al-Mutayri's eyes met mine, a fleeting connection that said more than any contract could. In 12 years of working together, through 7 major deals and countless smaller ones, we'd developed a language beyond words. A raised eyebrow when terms were unfavorable, a subtle nod when trust was confirmed. Now, his expression was unreadable granite. I stood slowly, gathering my papers with the deliberate calm of someone defusing a bomb. My fingers brushed the folder containing the full contract, 2,947 pages of meticulously negotiated terms, including one particular clause on page 1,764 that Julian had dismissed as standard boilerplate when I'd flagged it weeks ago. The continuity clause, in Arabic business culture, changing the official liaison during final negotiations wasn't just a personnel decision, it was a breach of faith. Mr. Al-Mutayri, I said in Arabic, my voice steady despite the earthquake in my chest. It has been an honor. His response was formal, ritualistic. The honor has been ours. But then he added something that wasn't part of the script, something that made his lawyers shift uncomfortably. Some bridges, once burned, cannot be rebuilt. Julian's Arabic was limited to hello and thank you. So he smiled blankly, probably thinking it was a standard farewell. Layla, fumbling with her phone's translation app, went pale. She'd caught enough to know it wasn't good. As I walked toward the door, my heels clicking against marble with metronomic precision, I heard Layla attempt to continue where I'd left off. Her pronunciation of liability came out as humiliation. The word hung in the air like a banner of incompetence. The last thing I saw before the door closed was Khalid Al-Mutayri pulling out his phone. The last thing I heard was Julian's voice, bright with ignorant confidence. Now, let's close this deal. They had no idea what they'd just set in motion. In that contract, buried in subsection 47B of the standard terms, was an authentication protocol that required my voice recognition at 3 stages of signing. My official, documented, contractually bound voice. Change the liaison before completion, and the entire agreement would void itself automatically, triggering a cascade of penalty clauses that would make $2.5 billion look like a rounding error. I didn't warn them. I didn't threaten. I simply walked to conference room B, where HR was waiting with a severance package and a non-disclosure agreement. They thought they were silencing me. They were actually pulling the pin from a grenade. I wasn't always the woman who could kill $1 billion deal with silence. 12 years ago, I was just another Georgetown linguistics graduate, serving coffee to executives who couldn't pronounce my last name correctly. Hallberg and West hired me as a junior coordinator, corporate speak for someone who schedules meetings and orders lunch. But I had something they didn't know they needed, a childhood spent in Kuwait where my father worked for an oil company, and a gift for languages that went beyond vocabulary. My first save came 6 months in. The firm was hemorrhaging money on a stalled Saudi construction project. The lead partner, Richard Hallberg himself, was ready to write off $40 million. I was photocopying contracts when I noticed a phrase in the Arabic version that didn't match the English. One word, taslim, versus tasalam. The difference between delivery and receipt. In Arabic contract law, that distinction meant everything. I knocked on Hallberg's door, hands shaking, and explained. He stared at me like I'd spoken in tongues. Then he called Riyadh. 3 hours later, the Saudis agreed to resume the project. The mistranslation hadn't been malicious, just incompetent. But my catch saved the deal and earned me a desk outside the boardroom instead of beside the copier. From there, I became Hallberg and West's secret weapon. Not officially. Of course. My title evolved from coordinator to analyst to assistant project director, but my real job was being the cultural bridge. I learned that Sheikh Rahman always paused for 30 seconds before agreeing to any deal. Americans who filled that silence with desperation always lost negotiating power. I discovered that Kuwaiti businessmen considered it disrespectful to discuss numbers during Ramadan afternoons, while Emiratis preferred to negotiate everything during elaborate dinners where business was never mentioned directly until dessert. The petroleum deal of 2018 was my masterpiece. $500 million hung on a single meeting in Houston. The translator Hallberg hired was technically proficient but culturally deaf. When the Qatari delegation's leader mentioned his son's graduation from MIT, the translator merely conveyed the words. I recognized it as an opening. In Gulf culture, mentioning family education was an invitation to establish personal connection before business. I interrupted, breaking protocol, and responded in Qatari dialect about MIT's engineering program, mentioning my own cousin who'd studied there. The tension in the room shifted. The Qatari leader smiled, the first genuine expression he'd shown. By the end of that meeting, we had our deal. The translator was furious, but Hallberg promoted me the next day. Then there was the banking crisis of 2019. Hallberg and West was structuring a complex financial instrument for Dubai Islamic Bank. The lawyers had been at it for months, but something felt wrong. I studied the documents at home, cross-referencing with Sharia banking principles I'd researched. At 3 a.m, I found it. The interest restructuring violated riba laws. It was disguised brilliantly, but it was there. I called our legal team immediately. They thought I was overreacting until the bank's Sharia board confirmed my suspicion. We restructured the entire deal, avoiding what would have been a catastrophic breach of trust. The Dubai partners sent me a handwritten note in Arabic. Your eyes see what others overlook. In their world, that was worth more than any bonus. But my real value wasn't just in translation or cultural knowledge, it was in the relationships. Chairman Al-Mutairi and I had worked together since 2015. Our first meeting was a disaster. The previous liaison had promised things Hallberg and West couldn't deliver. I spent 6 hours in his Riyadh office, admitting every failure, outlining exactly what we could and couldn't do. He tested me, switching between dialects, using obscure business terminology, referencing Islamic poetry to see if I'd understand the metaphors. I matched him, reference for reference. "You're not like the others," he'd said finally. "You understand that trust is built with truth, even when truth is uncomfortable." Over the years, I became the constant in a world of revolving executives. CEOs changed, project directors came and went, but I remained. The Arabs noticed, in their culture, consistency of relationship was everything. They'd joked that I was more reliable than the sunrise, that American companies had presidents but I was their ambassador. Each success should have elevated me, but it only made me more invisible to management. They saw the deals closing, but not the hundreds of hours preventing cultural disasters. They counted the profits, but not the relationships I'd spent years nurturing. When someone mentioned the Al-Mutairi account was easy money, I wanted to show them my notebooks. 50 volumes of cultural observations, dialect variations, family trees of business connections, notes on every slight or honor that could make or break a negotiation. But I stayed quiet, did my job, and believed that competence would eventually triumph over corporate politics. Then Julian Cross arrived, and I learned that in American business, being irreplaceable only matters if the person replacing you understands what they're destroying. Julian Cross arrived at Hallberg and West like a hurricane in an expensive suit. January 2024, middle of our fiscal year, brought in by the board to modernize operations and streamline inefficiencies. He was 34, with the kind of aggressive confidence that photographed well in business magazines. Stanford undergrad, Wharton MBA, 2 years at McKinsey where he'd learned to reduce human complexity to PowerPoint slides. His first all-hands meeting was a masterclass in corporate buzzwords: synergy, optimization, lean methodology. He showed charts proving we could cut project timelines by 40%, reduce redundant communications by half. When someone asked about client relationships, he actually said, and I'll never forget this, "Relationships are just inefficient transactions." I knew we were doomed when he restructured the Middle East division. He eliminated the cultural advisory role, merged translation services with general administration, and introduced what he called standardized interaction protocols. Essentially, he wanted to treat Sheikh Rahman the same way we'd treat a banker from Connecticut. "Sam," he said during our first one-on-one, "you're obviously talented, but you're holding too much institutional knowledge. It's a bottleneck. We need to democratize that information." Democratize, as if centuries of Arabic business culture could be reduced to a SharePoint folder. He assigned Layla Morton as my shadow, officially to learn, actually to document everything I did so they could create a playbook. Layla wasn't malicious, just catastrophically naive. She took notes on my translations but missed the body language. She recorded my phone conversations but didn't understand why I spent 20 minutes discussing a client's daughter's wedding before mentioning contracts. "Why don't you just email them the terms?" she asked once after watching me navigate a 3-hour dinner with Kuwaiti investors. "Because in their culture," I explained, "efficiency is rudeness, patience is respect. The longer you take to get to business, the more you're saying the relationship matters more than the transaction." She wrote it down, but I could see in her eyes she thought it was antiquated, inefficient, just like Julian did. The first crack appeared in February. Julian overruled my advice about a meeting with Emirates Global. I'd suggested hosting them at the private dining room at the Four Seasons. They valued privacy and luxury. Julian moved it to our office to showcase our facilities. The Emirates team arrived to find themselves in a glass conference room, visible to everyone, treated to the same mass-catered sandwiches we served everyone. "They're businessmen," Julian said when I protested. "They understand efficiency." The deal proceeded, but I noticed the Emiratis never removed their jackets, never touched the food, and left after exactly 1 hour, the minimum politeness required. We got the contract, but at 10% less than projected, and they never called us for follow-up opportunities. Julian counted it as a win. The board saw revenue. Nobody noticed the relationship hemorrhaging trust. Then came the Damascus Electronics situation. A Syrian-American company needed financing restructuring. The CEO, Bassam Haddad, had built his business on handshake deals and personal guarantees. Old school, even by Middle Eastern standards. Julian insisted on bringing in our Tiger team of young analysts who specialized in rapid restructuring. I watched them present their solutions to Haddad: leveraged buyouts, equity dilution, terms that would save his company but cost him his legacy. They spoke to him like he was a failing startup founder, not a man who'd built $1 million business from a refugee camp. Mr. Haddad, I intervened in Arabic. Would you prefer to discuss this privately? Julian cut me off. English only in client meetings. Sam, it's policy. It wasn't policy. It was his policy, implemented 2 weeks prior. I watched Haddad's face close like a door. The deal died that afternoon. You need to trust the process, Julian told me later. Your emotional involvement clouds your judgment. Emotional involvement. That's what he called 12 years of understanding that in Middle Eastern business, emotion and commerce were inseparable. That honor mattered more than money. That a man would rather lose millions than lose face. The breaking point came during the al-Mutayri preparation. Julian scheduled efficiency reviews for the contract. He brought in a consultant who specialized in cutting legal redundancies. Together, they stripped out what they called archaic provisions, the poetry of legal language that Arabs considered essential. The redundancies that weren't redundant but respectful emphasis. The authentication protocols they deemed unnecessarily complex. This continuity clause, Julian said, pointing at Section 47B, requiring voice authentication from a specific liaison. Legal says it's unenforceable. We're cutting it. It's not about enforcement, I tried to explain. It's about trust. Chairman al-Mutayri specifically requested. Then he'll be happy we're simplifying things. Time is money. Sam. But I knew the truth. In Arabic business culture, time is respect, tradition is trust. And changing a single comma in an agreed-upon provision is tantamount to calling someone a liar. I documented everything. Every dismissed warning, every overruled recommendation, every moment Julian's efficiency destroyed years of carefully built trust. Not for revenge, I'm not that petty. But because I knew that eventually, someone would need to understand why the empire fell. The night before the final meeting, I received a message from Khalid al-Mutayri. In Arabic, it simply said, "We remember who stood with us in the desert before there was oil." I understood. They knew what was coming. They were giving me the courtesy of a warning, the way I'd given them years of respect. Julian thought he was replacing inefficiency. He was actually demolishing architecture that had taken decades to build, one optimization at a time. The al-Mutayri deal was supposed to be Halberg & West's crown jewel, $2.5 billion for infrastructure development across 3 Gulf states, combining logistics, technology, and construction. It was the kind of deal that gets taught in business schools, dissected in journals, carved onto corporate tombstones. Julian saw it as his legacy project. I saw it as a house of cards built on cultural quicksand. The contract had taken 18 months to negotiate. I'd flown to Riyadh 14 times, to Dubai 8 times, spent countless nights reviewing terms with Islamic finance scholars to ensure every provision aligned with both Western law and Sharia principles. The authentication protocols weren't just legal formalities, they were trust made tangible. Section 47B, the continuity clause, was Chairman al-Mutayri's personal requirement. He'd been burned once before by a British firm that swapped negotiators mid-deal, turning carefully cultivated understandings into hostile renegotiations. "Your voice, Samantha," he'd said during a private dinner in his Riyadh garden, "is the signature we trust. Not your company's, yours." The clause was elegant in its simplicity. The designated liaison must provide voice authentication at 3 stages: initial agreement, fund transfer authorization, and final execution. Change the liaison without completing the sequence, and the contract wouldn't just pause, it would self-terminate, triggering penalty clauses that would make Halberg and West liable for all preparatory costs the Al-Mutairi Group had incurred. We're talking about hundreds of millions in architectural plans, permits, preliminary construction, and committed subcontracts. Julian never read that far. To him, 2,147 pages of contract was legal padding. He trusted executive summaries, bullet points, highlights. He didn't understand that in Arabic business culture, every word was a promise, every clause a testament to respect. I tried one last time to warn him. The week before the final meeting, I'd prepared a detailed memo outlining the authentication requirements, the cultural significance, the financial implications of disrupting the sequence. I even created a flowchart showing how the dominoes would fall if we changed liaisons. Julian's response was an email, sent at 11:47 p.m., probably from his Tesla while his autopilot drove him home. Sam, appreciate the thoroughness, but we need to move past this dependency. Layla's been shadowing you for months. Time to let her fly. Attached was a PowerPoint about knowledge transfer and sustainable succession planning. I discovered his real plan through Layla herself. She didn't mean to reveal it. She was nervous, practicing her Arabic pronunciation in the break room, and I overheard her on a call with Julian. Yes, I've memorized the opening statement Sam wrote, she was saying. But are you sure we shouldn't tell her she's being replaced? It seems she'll try to sabotage it. Julian's voice came through her phone, sharp and clear. These old-timers always do. We announce it during the meeting. Clean break. The Arabs won't make a scene in public. It's cultural. He was right about one thing. Arabs wouldn't make a scene, but he was catastrophically wrong about what they'd do instead. That night, I went home and pulled up the contract on my personal laptop. Every authentication point was highlighted, time-stamped, integrated into the blockchain verification system Al-Mutairi's tech team had insisted on. Immutable, irreversible, indisputable. My voice patterns were encoded at 17 different frequency points. Layla could speak perfect Arabic, and it wouldn't matter. The system would know. I could have sent an anonymous warning to the board, could have leaked to the Wall Street Journal, could have called Chairman Al-Mutairi directly and explained the situation. But I didn't. Because I'd learned something in 12 years of cross-cultural business. Sometimes the most profound statement is silence, and sometimes the best education is letting someone experience the full weight of their ignorance. I prepared for the meeting like a surgeon preparing for an operation I knew would fail. I wore my best suit, charcoal gray, the one Chairman Al-Mutairi once said reminded him of summer storms over the empty quarter. I compiled my files, organized 12 years of correspondence, created a transition document that explained everything except the one thing that mattered. The night before, I recorded a video on my phone, not for evidence or protection, but for myself. A reminder of who I was before the hurricane hit. Tomorrow, I told my reflection in the phone screen. Julian Cross will learn that efficiency without understanding is just destruction with a schedule. He thinks he's cutting fat. He's actually severing arteries. I saved the video, encrypted it, and filed it in a folder labeled After. Because I knew what was coming. The meeting would proceed, the replacement would be announced, the authentication would fail, and $2.5 billion would evaporate like water in the desert. Julian would scramble, lawyers would be called, and eventually, someone would ask the question that should have been asked from the beginning. What did we miss? And the answer would be everything. They missed everything that couldn't be captured in a PowerPoint slide or reduced to a process flow. They missed the fact that in the Middle East, business isn't about transactions. It's about trust. And trust, once broken, doesn't respond to optimization. The irony was perfect. Julian wanted to eliminate the bottleneck of my institutional knowledge. He was about to discover that some bottles, when broken, release storms that destroy everything in their path. I went to bed early that night, slept better than I had in months. Because for the first time in my career, I wasn't trying to save anyone from their own stupidity. I was going to let gravity do its work. The morning of March 15th arrived with unseasonable warmth. the kind that makes Manhattan's glass towers shimmer like mirages. I arrived at Halbergen West at 7 a.m., 2 hours before the meeting. The office was empty except for security and the cleaning crew. I made Arabic coffee in the break room, cardamom and saffron, the way Chairman al-Mutayiri preferred it. The familiar ritual steadied my hands. By 8:30, the 42nd floor was buzzing. Junior associates scurried with last-minute documents. Tech support tested the conference room's video systems, and Julian's Tiger team huddled around his office like disciples awaiting revelation. Layla stood among them, wearing a new suit that probably cost more than she'd made last month. Clutching the pronunciation guide I'd prepared weeks ago, I found her in the bathroom at 8:45, hyperventilating into a paper towel. "I can't do this," she gasped. "The opening blessing, I keep mixing up baraka and barakat. What if I offend them?" I could have let her drown. Instead, I fixed her makeup, corrected her pronunciation one last time, and told her the truth. "You're not ready for this, but that's not your fault." She looked at me with desperate eyes. "Why are you helping me?" "Because you're not the enemy. You're just the weapon." The al-Mutayiri delegation arrived at 9 sharp. 8 men in traditional dress, moving through our modern office like ghosts from an older, more dignified world. Chairman al-Mutayiri entered last, his presence commanding without effort. He found me immediately, our eyes meeting across the lobby. "Samantha," he said in Arabic, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You look well. And you, Chairman, look like a man who knows how stories end." Julian, hovering nearby with his plastic smile, interjected. "English, please. We want everyone to feel included." The chairman's expression didn't change, but his son Khalid's jaw tightened, a tell I'd learned to read years ago. They were already annoyed, and the meeting hadn't even started. We filed into Conference Room A, the one with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park. The seating had been arranged wrong. Julian had placed himself at the head of the table, making the chairman sit to his side like a subordinate. Another cultural insult. Probably unintentional. Definitely damaging. I was seated halfway down the table, strategically marginalized, close enough to translate if needed, far enough to signal my diminished importance. Layla sat where I should have been, at Julian's right hand, her face the color of expired milk. The meeting began with Julian's efficiency overview. 15 minutes of slides showing timeline compression and cost reductions. The Arabs listened with the patience of men watching a child explain why the sky should be green. When Julian finished, the silence lasted 8 seconds. In Arabic culture, that's the equivalent of a standing ovation for stupidity. Then came the moment. Julian stood, that practiced executive smile stretching his face. "Before we proceed with the signing, I want to announce an exciting transition. Layla Morton will be taking over as your primary liaison, bringing fresh perspective and streamlined communication to our partnership." He said it like he was announcing a promotion, not an execution. "Samantha has been invaluable," he continued, the past tense hitting like ice water. "But we believe in developing new talent and avoiding single points of failure." Single point of failure. He'd just called me, the woman who'd saved him from $40 million of mistakes, a failure point. Layla stood, trembling, and began the opening statement I'd written. Her Arabic was textbook perfect and culturally tone-deaf. She pronounced every word correctly and understood none of them. When she reached the blessing, "May Allah grant success to our endeavors," she emphasized the wrong syllable, turning a prayer into what sounded like a question about God's competence. The room's temperature dropped 10 degrees. Chairman al-Mutayiri raised one hand, a gentle gesture that stopped Layla mid-sentence. "Mr. Cross," he said in perfect English, each word carved from ice. "Am I to understand that Miss Whitford is no longer part of this transaction?" "She'll be transitioning to other projects," Julian replied, oblivious to the trap he was walking into. "But don't worry, Layla has been fully briefed." "I see." The chairman stood. His delegation followed in perfect synchronization, like a flock of birds responding to an invisible signal. Then we have a problem. Julian's smile finally cracked. I'm sorry. Is there an issue with Miss Whitford? The chairman addressed me directly, ignoring Julian entirely. Were you aware of this change? I stood slowly, matching his formal tone. I was informed this morning, Chairman. And the authentication protocols? Remain unchanged in the contract, sir. Julian interrupted, panic creeping into his voice. What authentication protocols? The chairman pulled out his phone, typed something quickly. Mr. Cross, I suggest you check Section 47B of our agreement, the one your efficiency expert deemed unnecessarily complex. I watched Julian's face as he frantically flipped through his tablet, searching for a clause he'd never bothered to read. Layla looked between us, lost, her carefully memorized Arabic suddenly useless. This can't be legally binding, Julian stammered. It is. Khalid al-Mutayri spoke for the first time, his Oxford-educated English sharp as a blade. Your legal team confirmed it, 3 times, in writing. The beautiful disaster unfolded in slow motion. Legal was called. The CFO was summoned. Someone from IT tried to explain blockchain authentication to Julian while he went from red to white to a concerning shade of gray. Meanwhile, the al-Mutayri delegation waited with the patience of men who'd already won. They didn't rage or threaten. They simply gathered their things with deliberate dignity. Before leaving, Chairman al-Mutayri approached me one last time. Some bridges, he said quietly in Arabic, are burned by those who don't even know they're holding matches. Then, louder, in English for everyone to hear, Miss Whitford, should you ever seek new opportunities, you have friends in Riyadh. They left at 9:47 a.m. The entire meeting had lasted less than an hour. The death of a $2.5 billion deal had taken 17 minutes. The aftermath was swift and surgical. Julian grabbed my arm as I walked toward the door, his grip just shy of bruising. You knew, he hissed. You knew this would happen. I wrote 3 memos, I replied calmly, removing his hand. Sent 14 emails, requested 4 meetings. You have a paper trail of my warnings spanning 6 weeks. Fix this. It wasn't a request. I can't. The authentication system requires biometric voice patterns captured over 3 sessions. My voice, specifically. You removed me before the sequence completed. The contract is void. HR was waiting in conference room B. Betty from Human Resources with her practiced sympathy and a manila folder that felt heavier than its weight suggested. Julian followed us, still in denial, still believing this was fixable. Samantha, Betty began. We've prepared a generous severance package. She's not leaving, Julian interrupted. Not until she fixes this mess. Actually, Betty continued, her voice steady. The decision has already been made. Samantha, your position has been eliminated effective immediately. The words hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. Position eliminated, not fired, not laid off, eliminated, as if I'd never existed. You'll receive 6 months severance, Betty continued, sliding papers across the table. Plus accumulated vacation time and a positive reference. In exchange, you'll sign this non-disclosure agreement and agree to a non-compete clause for 18 months. I read every line while Julian paced behind me, making calls that grew increasingly frantic. Get legal up here now. I don't care if he's in Tokyo, wake him up. Find me an expert in blockchain authentication. At 10:15, my company phone was deactivated. By 10:30, my access badge was collected. By 10:45, I was standing on Fifth Avenue with a banker's box of personal items, watching through the lobby windows as executives ran between floors like ants whose hill had been kicked. I took a taxi home to my Brooklyn brownstone, the one I'd bought with my first real bonus. The driver, an older Pakistani man, noticed my box and asked in Urdu if I'd been fired. No, I replied in his dialect. I was liberated. He laughed, refused my tip, and said, Sometimes Allah closes doors, so we stop trying to walk through walls. My personal phone had stayed silent during the meeting, but now it exploded. 17 missed calls from various Hallberg and West numbers. 43 text messages ranging from pleading to threatening. Voicemails from people who hadn't spoken to me in years, suddenly remembering my value. I turned it off and made tea. At 2 p.m., I opened my laptop and logged into my personal email. There it was, waiting like a gift. An automated notification from the Al-Mutairi Holdings contract management system. Authentication sequence incomplete. Contract 7744B has been terminated per Section 47B. Penalty clauses are now in effect. Estimated liability: $340 million. $340 million. That was the cost of Julian's efficiency. I pulled up my investment portfolio and initiated a short sell on Hallberg and West stock. Not enough to trigger SEC attention, just enough to benefit from the inevitable. Some would call it insider trading. I called it severance adjustment. By 4:01 p.m., the first news alerts appeared. Major Gulf infrastructure deal collapses. Hallberg and West faces questions over failed Al-Mutairi partnership. The stories were vague, citing personnel changes and authentication issues. The real story would come later, when someone leaked the details. At 6 p.m., Richard Hallberg himself called my personal number. I let it go to voicemail. "Samantha, it's Richard. We need to talk. There's been a misunderstanding. Julian acted without board approval. We're prepared to reinstate you immediately with a promotion to senior vice president. Please call me." I deleted it. At 8 p.m., I ordered Chinese food and opened a bottle of wine I'd been saving for a special occasion. While eating lo mein from the container, I composed a single email to my personal contacts at other firms, the people I'd saved, helped, or worked with over the years. The subject line was simple: available for new opportunities. By the time I finished dinner, I had 7 interview offers. At midnight, I finally turned my phone back on. 137 missed calls. The last voicemail was from Julian, recorded at 11:47 p.m. His voice was broken, defeated. "The board is meeting tomorrow morning. They want answers I don't have. They want to know how I missed something so crucial. Samantha, please. I know I didn't listen before, but I'm listening now. Please." I deleted that one too. Before bed, I checked the contract system one more time. The penalties were accumulating, $50,000 for each day of delay, compounding daily. By morning, Hallberg and West would owe the Al-Mutairi Group nearly $342 million. I slept better than I had in years. No dreams, no anxiety, just the deep rest that comes from releasing a burden you never should have carried. They'd wanted to eliminate a single point of failure. They'd succeeded. They'd eliminated the single point that was preventing failure. The poetry of it was perfect. In trying to destroy what they saw as weakness, they'd revealed their own. In silencing my voice, they'd amplified its absence. Protocol 9 had activated exactly as designed, not because I'd triggered it, but because they had. The collapse began at 6:47 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, when the Tokyo markets opened. A minor note in the Nikkei financial report: Hallberg and West faces significant penalties over failed Gulf infrastructure deal. By the time London opened, it was a headline. By 9:30 a.m., when the NYSE bell rang, it was a catastrophe. I watched from my kitchen, laptop open to multiple news feeds, coffee growing cold as the numbers turned red. Hallberg and West opened at $127.43 per share. Within 30 minutes, it hit $98.20. The short sell I'd placed yesterday was already worth 3 times my annual salary. CNBC picked up the story at 10 a.m. A reporter standing outside Hallberg and West's building, breathlessly explaining authentication protocols she clearly didn't understand. Then came the leaked video. Someone had recorded the meeting on their phone. Grainy footage of Chairman Al-Mutairi's delegation walking out. Julian's panicked face, my calm exit. The internet loved it. Details Matter started trending within an hour. But the real devastation came from an unexpected source, a young Emirati blogger named Yasmin who ran a business culture site. She'd somehow obtained Layla's botched opening statement and posted a linguistic analysis. How American arrogance destroyed a $2.5 billion deal went viral across the Middle East. She dissected every mispronunciation, every cultural insult, with surgical precision. The phrase that killed me, they replaced a bridge with Google Translate. By noon, Al-Mutayri Holdings released an official statement. It was a masterpiece of diplomatic destruction. We entered negotiations with Halberg and West in good faith, building upon 12 years of successful partnership facilitated by trusted intermediaries. The unilateral termination of established protocols, without consultation or consent, reflects a fundamental misalignment of values. We wish Halberg and West success in their future endeavors and remain committed to partnerships that honor both contractual obligations and cultural understanding. Translation: You're dead to us, and we're telling everyone why. The Wall Street Journal called at 2 p.m. The reporter, Jennifer Liu, had done her homework. Ms. Whitford, sources indicate you warned management about the authentication protocols multiple times. Can you comment on the decision to proceed with your replacement? I'm bound by a non-disclosure agreement, I replied carefully, but I can confirm that I always acted in the best interest of successful completion of the deal. Sources also say Chairman Al-Mutayri specifically requested your involvement. Is it true the contract contained provisions requiring your personal authentication? I refer you to Halberg and West's legal department for contract details. She paused. Off the record, did you see this coming? On the record, I said. Cultural competence isn't inefficiency. It's infrastructure. When you demolish infrastructure to save time, you shouldn't be surprised when everything collapses. She quoted that line in her article. It became the pull quote, highlighted in yellow across the digital edition. By 3 p.m., the board had called an emergency meeting. Someone live tweeted from the lobby. Apparently, security had been tripled, and lawyers were arriving in Blacktown cars like a funeral procession. Richard Halberg was photographed entering through the parking garage, his face gaunt. At 4:30 p.m., the SEC announced a preliminary investigation into potential disclosure violations. Had Halberg and West properly informed shareholders about the risks of the Al-Mutayri deal? Had they accurately represented their Middle East capabilities? The stock dropped another 12%. Then came the domino effect I hadn't anticipated. 3 other Middle Eastern clients announced reviews of their Halberg and West contracts. A Kuwaiti sovereign wealth fund withdrew from a pending merger. Qatar Industrial Bank posted a terse message, evaluating all partnerships for cultural alignment. My phone rang constantly, recruiters, reporters, former colleagues suddenly remembering our friendship. I ignored them all except one, Khalid Al-Mutayri. Samantha, he said in Arabic, my father wanted to ensure you were well. I'm perfectly fine, Khalid. Thank you for asking. We've heard Halberg and West is claiming you sabotaged the deal. Are they? Internal emails were leaked to Bloomberg an hour ago. Julian Cross suggested you deliberately withheld information. I laughed, genuinely amused. I documented everything, Khalid, every warning, every meeting, every dismissed concern. If they want to play that game, I have receipts. We know, he said simply. So does our legal team, and our public relations firm. And the journalist from the Financial Times we're having dinner with tomorrow. The line went quiet for a moment. Samantha, he continued, you could have warned us directly. We would have insisted on your retention. And then it would have been my word against theirs. This way, they wrote their own story. He made a sound that might have been approval. My father says you play chess like a Bedouin. You let the desert win your battles. By 5 p.m., when markets closed, Halberg and West had lost 38% of its value. $3 billion in market cap evaporated. The financial news channels were calling it Black Tuesday for the firm. I turned off my laptop, silenced my phone, and went for a walk through Prospect Park. It was the first warm day of spring, and families were out with their children. Couples spread blankets on the grass, life continuing its rhythm while a corporate empire burned. My personal email chimed with a priority message. The sender was listed only as Riyadh Opportunities. Inside was a single line. The office awaits when you're ready. A. Abdullah Al-Mutairi, offering me a position without even discussing terms. In his world, that was the highest honor, trust so complete that details were irrelevant. I didn't reply immediately. I wanted to watch the rest of the collapse first. Not from spite, but from professional curiosity. How long would it take them to realize that efficiency without understanding wasn't just ineffective, it was entropy? The answer would come tomorrow, when the board met with shareholders, when Julian Cross would have to explain how he'd optimized their way into disaster. The emergency shareholder meeting was scheduled for 8 a.m. on March 17th. Someone had leaked the dial-in information to a financial blogger, who live-streamed the entire thing. I listened from my kitchen, making breakfast while Richard Hallberg's voice crackled through my laptop speakers. The failure of the Al-Mutairi partnership represents a systematic breakdown in communication protocols. He began, reading from what was obviously a lawyer-approved script. We accept responsibility while maintaining that all parties acted in good faith. Then came the questions. Angry shareholders demanding answers, accountability, blood. Who authorized the personnel change? Why weren't risk factors properly disclosed? How did no one see this coming? Julian's voice, when he finally spoke, was hollow. I believed we were modernizing our approach. I didn't fully appreciate the nuanced nature of these relationships. Nuanced. 12 years of my life reduced to a word he'd just learned. Then came the question that changed everything. An institutional investor from Dubai. His accent familiar. Mr. Cross, I have one simple question. Who was the person the Al-Mutairi group trusted most in your organization? Silence, 10 seconds, 20, 10. I believe they had a strong working relationship with Samantha Whitford. Had? Past tense? Where is Ms. Whitford now? She pursued other opportunities. You mean you fired her, during the deal, without consulting your largest Middle Eastern client? It wasn't a question. The decision was made to Mr. Hallberg. The investor interrupted. I'm pulling our fund's entire position, effective immediately. The dominoes fell fast after that. 3 more major investors announced withdrawals. The board called for an immediate vote of no confidence. By 9:30 a.m., Julian Cross had been terminated. By 10:00 a.m., Richard Hallberg announced his retirement. Effective immediately. My phone rang. Unknown number, New York area code. Ms. Whitford? The voice was older, authoritative. This is David Chen, interim CEO of Hallberg & West. The board has asked me to reach out personally. Congratulations on your appointment, Mr. Chen. I'll be direct. We need you back. Name your terms. I looked out my window at the Brooklyn skyline, considering. I'm afraid that bridge has been burned. Bridges can be rebuilt. Not this one. You see, Mr. Chen, trust is like gravity, invisible until it's gone. Then everything falls. He sighed. The board authorized me to offer you. Mr. Chen, I interrupted gently. There isn't enough money in your budget to buy back what you threw away, but I wish you luck. You'll need it. I hung up and called Khalid Al-Mutairi. I accept your father's offer, I said in Arabic. Excellent. When can you start? Give me 2 weeks to close things here. Perfect. Oh, and Samantha? Check the news. I pulled up Bloomberg. The headline made me smile. Al-Mutairi Holdings announces New York division, promises relationship-first approach to Western markets. They were entering Hallberg & West's territory, with me as their weapon. 3 months later, I stood in my new office overlooking Central Park. Different building, same view, triple the salary. My title was simply Director of Western Operations. But everyone knew what I really was. The bridge. The one they'd burned. The one that had been rebuilt with stronger foundations. Julian Cross lasted 6 weeks at his next job before being quietly let go. Layla Morton returned to business school. Hallberg and West never recovered within a year. They were acquired by a German firm for a fraction of their former value. The afternoon of my first major success at Al-Mutairi Holdings, a $3.8 billion partnership with a Texas energy firm. Chairman Al-Mutairi called from Riyadh. "Samantha," he said, "do you know what we call someone who burns their own house to spite their enemy?" "What?" "An American." "But you," he chuckled, "you're something else. You let them burn their own house while you were already building your next one." I looked at the contract on my desk, my signature next to the authentication seal, my voice recognized, my value undeniable. "Chairman," I said, "I learned from the best. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is nothing at all." "Indeed." "Oh, and Samantha? Julian Cross applied for a position with our London office yesterday." I actually laughed. "And we told him we require all executives to spend 2 years learning Arabic and Middle Eastern culture first. He won't last 2 weeks." "We know. That's why we offered him the position." After we hung up, I stood at my window, watching the city pulse below. Hallberg and West's old building was visible in the distance, their logo being removed letter by letter from the facade. They'd wanted to eliminate a single point of failure. Instead, they'd discovered that some points aren't failures, they're foundations. Remove them, and everything collapses. The irony was perfect. In trying to make themselves more efficient, they'd learned the most expensive lesson in business. Some bridges, once burned, light fires that consume empires. Mine had lit a $3 billion inferno, and from its ashes, I'd built something better. Thank you so much for listening to this story of corporate revenge and cultural redemption. I'm curious, where are you listening from? Drop a comment below and let me know what city or country you're in. I love connecting with listeners from around the world. If this story of workplace justice resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel and share your own thoughts about office politics and revenge. Have you ever witnessed a corporate giant fall because they ignored the small details? Let me know in the comments.